The name on the bow, 9,343 people. That number is 6 times larger than the number of people who died on the Titanic. The Titanic has museums, films, memorials in 6 countries. 100 years later, you can go online right now and find the name of every single person who died on it, the cabin number they slept in, the last meal they ate. 9,343 people died in a single night in January 1945 in the Baltic Sea on a German ocean liner. You almost certainly have never heard their names. You have possibly never heard of the ship. To understand why, you have to go back 9 years to a doorbell. Davos, Switzerland, February 4th, 1936. A 25-year-old man named David Frankfurter has been standing in a hallway for 11 minutes. He is holding a pistol inside his coat pocket. He bought it 4 months ago from a sporting goods store. He paid cash and did not ask questions because he had already made the most important decision of his life. And the decision had nothing to do with the gun. The decision was this: David Frankfurter was going to die. Not from illness, though he had tuberculosis and the treatment was not working. Not from despair, though he had failed his medical exams twice and had almost no money. He had chosen to die on purpose, as a strategy. He had spent months selecting a target, a location, and a method. And the method was not just shooting someone. The method was shooting someone and then walking to the nearest police station and surrendering immediately and standing trial in full view of the Swiss and European press. He wanted his execution to be the story. The man behind the door was Wilhelm Gustloff, Nazi party leader for all of Switzerland. His name would be read in every newspaper in Europe if Frankfurter killed him. A Jewish student murders a senior Nazi official on neutral soil. The trial would be public. The coverage would be unavoidable. The world would have to pay attention, at least for a few weeks, to what was actually happening inside Germany. That was the plan. Frankfurter rings the doorbell. Hedwig Gustloff, Wilhelm's wife, opens the door. She sees a young man she does not recognize. Before she can ask why he is there, Frankfurter steps past her and walks down the hallway toward the study. At that moment, Wilhelm Gustloff is sitting at his desk on the telephone. He looks up. He watches a stranger walk into his room and raise a pistol. He does not move. He does not speak. Frankfurter fires 5 times. Gustloff falls where he is sitting. In the hallway, Hedwig hears the shots. She runs to the study doorway. She has the telephone receiver in her hand. She had been in the middle of a conversation when she answered the door. She stands in the doorway, looking at her husband, and the person on the other end of the line is still there, still saying hello, still asking what happened to the sound. Frankfurter puts the pistol in his jacket and walks out past her. He goes directly to the nearest police station. He tells the officer at the desk, "I killed Wilhelm Gustloff. I did it because I am Jewish." He sits down and waits to be arrested. He is 25 years old. He is certain he will be executed within the year. He is wrong, but we will come back to that. To understand what happens next, you need to understand what Wilhelm Gustloff was actually doing in Davos, because it was not what it looked like from the outside. On the surface, Gustloff was an unremarkable German emigrant. He had come to Davos in 1927 to recover from tuberculosis, same disease as Frankfurter, and had simply stayed. He married a Swiss woman. He learned the local dialect. His neighbors described him as polite, quiet, and helpful. He had lived in that building on Bundesstrasse for 9 years without a single complaint. What he was actually doing behind the polite surface was running a foreign intelligence operation. Gustloff was the head of the Nazi Party's overseas organization for all of Switzerland. He held meetings in private homes. He registered German citizens living in Switzerland, catalogued their politics, their professions, their religious backgrounds. He compiled detailed dossiers on German Jews living abroad and forwarded those lists to the Gestapo in Berlin, where the information was used to locate families, freeze accounts, revoke passports, and in some cases, arrange arrests when those people returned home or when their relatives were targeted. He did this from a quiet office in a Swiss mountain town. He did this while being invited to his neighbors' dinner parties. The Swiss authorities watched him for years and could never find a specific law he was breaking. He was simply a German citizen organizing other German citizens. The surveillance state he was feeding was in another country. Frankfurter knew what Gustloff was doing. That is part of why he chose him. Hitler received the news of Gustloff's death at his residence in Munich. What he said in the first moments, privately, was not recorded. What he did publicly, within 48 hours, tells you everything you need to know. He declared a state funeral. He came to Schwerin in person. He gave a speech in which he described Gustloff as a martyr, a German who served his people abroad and was murdered by an agent of international Jewry. The phrase international Jewry appeared 17 times in official Nazi press coverage in the 2 weeks that followed. The funeral was filmed from multiple angles. Photographs were distributed to every newspaper outlet with a German press agreement. Gustloff's coffin traveled through the streets of Schwerin on a gun carriage, while tens of thousands of people lined the route. Hitler stood at the graveside with tears on his face. Those tears were photographed from 4 different positions. The German press ran the Gustloff story for 12 consecutive days. They published Frankfurter's full background, his religion, his nationality, his failed examinations, his illness. They described him not as a desperate young man acting alone, but as evidence of an organized international conspiracy against Germany. Every detail of his biography was turned into proof of what the Nazi government had been claiming all along. Frankfurter had planned to make the killing a story. He had not planned for the Nazi propaganda apparatus to rewrite the story completely within 72 hours of the killing. He had given them something they had been looking for: a Jewish assassin, photographed, arrested, confessing, on the front pages of every European newspaper. His trial took place in December 1936. He was found guilty of premeditated murder. The sentence was 18 years in a Swiss prison. He was not executed. Switzerland had abolished the death penalty for civilian crimes a generation earlier. The execution Frankfurter had intended as his message to the world would not happen. He would go to prison instead, alive, while everything he had tried to warn the world about continued without him. In the summer of 1937, Germany held a christening ceremony for a new ocean liner. The ship had been built under a government program called Strength Through Joy, which was designed to give German workers access to leisure that had previously been available only to the wealthy. The ship had a heated swimming pool, a cinema, a dance hall, and a deliberate design feature that Nazi officials described in every press release. There was no first class. There was no second class. Every cabin on the ship was identical. A factory worker from the Ruhr Valley would sleep in the same cabin as an engineer from Berlin. The ideology was built into the blueprints. The ship could carry 1,900 passengers in comfort. It was one of the largest passenger vessels Germany had ever built. They needed a name. They needed a name that would appear in ports across Europe, on the sides of newsreel footage, in photographs, in magazines. A name associated with German suffering and German sacrifice. They named it Wilhelm Gustloff. At the christening ceremony, 50,000 people gathered at the docks in Hamburg. Adolf Hitler gave a speech. Hedwig Gustloff, the widow, stood at the podium and broke the ceremonial bottle against the hull. The ship was a propaganda instrument disguised as a cruise liner. Every time it entered a port, it carried the message that Germany had victims too, that the forces arrayed against the new Germany had drawn first blood, that a Jewish gunman had murdered an innocent man in neutral Switzerland. David Frankfurter read about the christening from his prison cell. He had killed Wilhelm Gustloff so that his own death would be the story. Instead, his victim had been turned into a ship. Frankfurter spent the next 8 years in that Swiss cell. He read the newspapers every day, and every day the newspapers described what was happening to people who looked like him in countries that had once felt safe. He read about Kristallnacht from prison. He read about the fall of France from prison. He read about the deportations from prison. He requested the Swiss papers daily, and the prison allowed it. And he sat and read and stayed alive, while the world he had tried to warn burned from one end to the other. In October 1945, 5 months after Germany surrendered, the Swiss government released him under a special provision for exceptional circumstances. He walked out of prison and read the newspaper. The Wilhelm Gustloff had sunk in January, 9 months earlier, in the Baltic Sea. In one night, over 9,000 people had died on it. He had been in prison when it happened. He had not known. The ship named after the man he killed was already at the bottom of the sea. The man who had wanted to die was still alive. He would live for 37 more years. He emigrated to what became Israel. He had a family. He died in 1982. There are people alive today who shook his hand. The dream ship, Heinz Schoen, was 22 years old, and his job was to count people. He was the ship's purser, the officer responsible for passenger manifests, cabin assignments, and administrative records. On the morning of January 22nd, 1945, he stood at the top of the Gustloff's gangway with a clipboard and watched East Prussia arrive. They came on foot. They came on carts. Some of them came off military trucks that had stopped at the port long enough to unload passengers and then driven away without explanation. Women with children wrapped against the cold. Old men who had walked for days in temperatures of minus 20 degrees and whose coats had frozen stiff on their bodies. A mother carrying a child who was not moving and would not explain why the child was not moving. Soldiers with missing limbs being carried by other soldiers who were themselves injured. Schoen later wrote that in his first hour on the gangway, he stopped trying to count individuals and started counting groups. It was the only way to keep up. By that evening, the number on his clipboard was already past what the ship was designed to hold. He went to find a senior officer to ask what he should do. The answer he'd received was, "Keep counting. You have heard of Dunkirk." In May 1940, The British and French evacuated 338,000 soldiers from the beaches of northern France over 9 days. It was a military operation of extraordinary courage and improvisation. It has a major film, dozens of books, memorials on both sides of the English Channel. Operation Hannibal evacuated over 2 million people from the eastern Baltic over 4 months. It is the largest naval evacuation in the history of the world, 6 times the scale of Dunkirk. It is almost completely unknown outside Germany and the countries of the former Soviet Union. By the time the Wilhelm Gustloff left Gotenhafen on January 30th, the Soviet army had advanced 300 kilometers in 18 days and was engaging German forces within artillery range of the port. The evacuation was not an organized military withdrawal. It was a collapse in progress, and the ships were all that stood between the people on the docks and whatever the Soviet army would do when it arrived. The Gustloff was designed to carry 1,900 passengers. By morning of January 30th, Schoen's manifest showed 10,582 people on board. Of those, 6,050 were civilian refugees, mostly women and children from East Prussia and the occupied territories to the east. 918 were naval cadets, submarine officer trainees, being moved west before Soviet capture. 373 were female naval auxiliaries, women who had served in communications and administration. 162 were severely wounded soldiers who could not walk unassisted. The rest were a mixture of military personnel, naval staff, and people who had boarded in the chaos before anyone had time to verify their documentation. For every person the ship was designed to hold, there were now 5.5. Schoen stopped updating the manifest at some point in the late morning because the numbers stopped being manageable. People were sleeping in the drained swimming pool. They were packed into the corridors 3 and 4 deep. In the ballroom, which during peacetime had held dances for vacationing German workers, families had staked out areas of floor the size of a single mattress and were defending them with their bodies. The ship smelled of wet wool and kerosene and unwashed people, and the particular smell of fear, which is different from other smells, and which Schoen later said he never forgot. The Wilhelm Gustloff had been built in 1937 as part of a Nazi government program called Strength Through Joy. The government's idea was that happy workers were productive workers, and productive workers would be loyal to the state. The ship would take factory laborers on Mediterranean cruises they could never otherwise afford. There was a heated swimming pool. There was a cinema. There was a deliberate design decision. No first class, no second class. Every cabin identical. The workers would experience luxury without hierarchy. It had carried exactly that for 2 years, until the war started. After September 1939, it became a hospital ship, then a floating barracks for submarine trainees, and then, by January 1945, a potential evacuation vessel. It had not sailed in open water with passengers for almost 6 years. Several of its mechanical systems had not been tested under operational conditions in years. The lifeboats had been sitting in their davits through 3 Baltic winters. At minus 18 degrees Celsius, wet metal freezes. Ropes become brittle. Release mechanisms jam. No lifeboat drill had been conducted. There was no time. At 1 in the afternoon on January 30th, 4 men met in the captain's cabin to discuss the route. The first was Friedrich Petersen, the Gustloff's civilian master. He was 67 years old. brought back from retirement because there were not enough experienced captains available. He had spent his career commanding peacetime passenger vessels. He had not sailed in an active combat zone in years. The second was Wilhelm Gustloff, a lieutenant commander assigned as military transport supervisor for the voyage. Gustloff was a decorated U-boat commander. He had spent the early years of the war inside German submarines, had stalked Allied shipping through the Atlantic, and understood with precise technical knowledge what a torpedo did to a ship and to the people inside it. These two men did not agree on anything. There were two possible routes west: the shallow coastal route, running close to the shoreline. The depth made submarine attack difficult, but the waters had not been fully cleared of mines, and a vessel the size of the Gustloff ran a genuine risk of contact with the bottom in certain sections, or the deep water channel, running further out into the open Baltic. German naval vessels used it routinely. It had been swept for mines, but the water depth was ideal for submarine operations. Peterson wanted the shallow route. He had seen what mines did to large ships, and he was not willing to take that risk with 10,000 people on board. Gustloff wanted the deep water channel. He had spent years inside submarines. He knew how a submarine commander chosen his targets. He knew that depth and darkness and a cleared channel were not the same as safety. They were both right. They were afraid of different things, and both of the things they were afraid of were real. Gustloff argued his case for 20 minutes. He was a decorated combat officer with direct experience of submarine warfare. Peterson was a retired civilian captain who had not been in a war zone for years. The military hierarchy gave more weight to Gustloff's assessment. The deep water channel was chosen. Then came the second decision. German minesweepers were operating that night in the same waters the Gustloff would be crossing. They ran without lights. Peterson, or someone in his chain of command, made a decision. The Gustloff would sail with its navigation lights on to avoid a collision with friendly vessels in the dark, in wartime, in the Baltic Sea, in January 1945, on a ship carrying 10,582 people. A navigation light is visible from approximately 12 nautical miles on a clear night. Whoever made that decision signed 9,343 death certificates. They did not know they were doing that. They were making a reasonable judgment about the risk of a collision with their own minesweepers. Every decision made on that ship that day was made by a person doing their best with the information they had. That is the most disturbing part of what happened. There was no single villain in the captain's cabin. There were experienced men making defensible decisions, and the combination of those decisions would produce one of the worst disasters in maritime history. At 12:30 in the afternoon, the Gustloff left the port of Gottenhafen and moved slowly into the open Baltic. A torpedo boat named the Lure sailed alongside as escort. Two smaller vessels were assigned to join the convoy, but one developed engine trouble within hours and fell behind. A second turned back. By evening, the Gustloff had one escort. Below decks, 10,000 people tried to find ways to sleep through the cold and the noise and the packed density of other human bodies. In the converted ballroom, Schoen moved through the crowd, checking on the wounded soldiers who had been laid on stretchers along the walls. He noted in his diary that some of them were already dead, and that he did not report this immediately because he did not know who to report it to, or what would be done if he did. He wrote, "The ship feels like a city that fell into a bottle. Outside, The Baltic was running 1.5 meters of swell. The air temperature had dropped to -18. The water was just above freezing. A person in that water without a survival suit would lose consciousness within 30 minutes. On the deck, the Gustloff's navigation lights were burning. They were visible for 12 nautical miles in every direction. At 9:04 in the evening, 12 nautical miles to the northeast, Soviet submarine S-13 rose to periscope depth for a routine observation sweep. The commander pressed his eye to the glass and rotated slowly through the darkness. He stopped rotating. Ahead of him, against the black of the Baltic night, something was lit up. The man under tribunal, Turku, Finland. The evening of January 3rd, 1945. Soviet submarine S-13 was docked at the Finnish port on a resupply stop. Its crew was aboard. Its torpedo systems had been checked and rechecked. It was ready for the next patrol. The only thing missing was its commander. Alexander Marinescu had been gone for 3 days. His first officer knew where he was. So did most of the crew. He was somewhere in the city with a Finnish woman he had met 2 days after docking, in a situation that violated approximately 7 separate regulations of the Soviet Naval Code. Finland had signed an armistice with the Soviet Union 4 months earlier and was technically no longer the enemy, but a Soviet submarine commander disappearing into a foreign city for 72 hours was not something that fell into any comfortable legal category. Soviet Naval Command was already preparing a file. When Marinescu finally returned to the ship on January 4th, his first officer told him that a military tribunal was almost certain. Under Soviet military law in 1945, the range of possible sentences for what he had done started at demotion and ended at execution. Marinescu told his first officer he understood the situation. Then he asked what was for dinner. To understand who Alexander Marinescu was, you need to start with his father. Jan Marinescu was a Romanian sailor who in 1917 deserted from the Austro-Hungarian Navy. He stole a rowboat, crossed the Black Sea, and arrived in Odessa with nothing except the clothes he was wearing and a name he would eventually give to his son. He was the kind of man who made decisions that looked insane from the outside and turned out, in the specific circumstances he put himself in, to work. Alexander was born in Odessa in 1913. He was on the water before he could properly read. He joined the Merchant Marine at 15 and the Soviet Navy at 22. By the time the war started, he was already in command of a submarine, and by any objective measure, he was exceptional at it. Submarine command requires 2 things that are difficult to find in the same person. The first is technical precision, the ability to hold dozens of mechanical and navigational variables in your head simultaneously and make calculations under pressure that cannot afford to be wrong. The second is a willingness to make decisions that have no guaranteed outcome, to take your crew and your vessel into situations where survival depends on a judgment call, not a procedure. Marinescu had both. He was also an alcoholic who stole food from naval stores, disappeared for days at a time, ignored orders he found inconvenient, and had been written up so many times that his personnel file was, by 1945, thicker than his operational record. Soviet Naval Command could not promote him because of his file. They could not transfer him because he was too effective. They kept him where he was and kept hoping he would either get himself killed or produce results significant enough to justify the trouble he caused. By January 1945, the tribunal file from Turku was on the desk of the Baltic Fleet commander. The recommendation from Marinesco's direct superior was to give him one final combat patrol. If he performed, the tribunal would be quietly shelved. If he failed, or if he caused any further incident, the file would go forward, and whatever happened next would not be a demotion. S-13 left Turku on January 11th, 1945, 19 days before the Gustloff left Copenhagen. For 19 days, S-13 found nothing worth attacking. The Baltic in January was dangerous for submarines on both sides. German anti-submarine patrols were active. The waters were shallow in sections, and the winter weather made navigation difficult. Marinesco ran several approaches on potential targets and broke off each time when the tactical situation did not hold. His crew respected this. You did not get to lead multiple combat patrols in the Baltic by being reckless. When Marinesco said the conditions were wrong, the conditions were wrong. At the same time, 700 kilometers to the west, in a Swiss prison near Regensdorf, David Frankfurter was reading the January newspapers. He had been following the course of the war from his cell for 5 years. He knew the Red Army had crossed into East Prussia. He knew refugees were moving toward the Baltic coast. He did not know there was a ship. He did not know there was a submarine. He did not know that 19 days from that particular evening, all three of those facts would occupy the same point in history. By the evening of January 30, 19 days into a patrol with nothing to show for it, S-13 was running submerged on electric motors near the Stolpa Bank southwest of the Polish coast. At 9:04 in the evening, Marinesco ordered the submarine to periscope depth for a routine observation. He looked through the glass. He rotated slowly through the darkness. He stopped. Ahead of him, on the western horizon, a ship was lit up. Not partially lit, not dimly lit. Navigation lights burning fully, visible from 12 nautical miles away, moving west through the Baltic night. To a submarine commander, this was not normal. In wartime, ships did not advertise their position. Marinesco watched for 2 minutes, studying the silhouette and the speed. The target was large, very large, moving at approximately 12 knots. He called battle stations. What Marinesco did next was not what submarine doctrine prescribed. Standard procedure for a submerged attack was to move into position below the surface, fire, and dive deep before the escort vessels could localize the submarine's position. It was slower and more complicated, but it kept the submarine safe. Marinesco surfaced. He took S-13 to the surface in the middle of a combat zone, 12 nautical miles from a target with at least one armed escort, and ran on his diesel engines at maximum speed to get into firing position. A submarine on the surface is faster than a submarine submerged. He calculated that if he moved quickly on the surface, he could get ahead of the target, position himself for a firing solution, and attack before the escort detected him. He was also positioning himself between the target and the German coastline to the south. This meant that if S-13 was spotted and the escort turned toward him, he had less open water to escape into. He knew this. He chose the position anyway because the firing angle was better. For 70 minutes, Marinesco ran parallel to the Gustloff on the surface, in the dark, in the Baltic winter, with his crew at battle stations and a torpedo boat a few kilometers away from him. His first officer later said the atmosphere inside the submarine was complete silence, broken only by the sound of the diesel engines and Marinesco, who stood on the conning tower in the open air, for most of those 70 minutes, watching. At 11:08 in the evening, S-13 was in position. Firing depth, 1,000 meters. 3 torpedoes had been prepared. The crew had written messages on the casing of each one. The first torpedo was labeled, "For the Motherland." The second, "For Stalin." The third, "For the Soviet people." At 11:08, Marinesco gave the order. The first torpedo was fired. The second torpedo was fired. The third torpedo was fired. And then the fourth torpedo tube malfunctioned. A fourth torpedo, prepared as a reserve shot, jammed in the tube and did not fire. The firing mechanism had stuck. Inside the tube, a live torpedo with an armed warhead was wedged and not responding to commands. This was, in the context of what was happening on the surface of the water 1,000 meters away, a separate emergency entirely. While the first 3 torpedoes crossed the distance to the Gustloff, a torpedo technician named Yefremenko was attempting to manually defuse a live warhead inside a torpedo tube aboard a submarine that was now, because of the attack, about to be hunted by every German vessel in the area. Marinesco kept his position. The first torpedo hit the bow of the Gustloff at 11:09. The second hit the forward crew quarters 4 seconds later. The third hit the engine room 7 seconds after that. On the bridge of S-13, Marinesco felt the detonations through the hull of the submarine in the water. The German torpedo boat, Lowe, the Gustloff's only escort, turned and began moving toward S-13's last known position. Marinesco ordered the submarine to dive. Below decks, Yefremenko was still working on the jammed torpedo tube. The Lowe began dropping depth charges. The first pattern detonated approximately 400 meters from S-13. The second pattern was closer. Inside the submarine, depth charges sound like a fist hitting the outside of the hull, but louder, and they can keep hitting for as long as the surface vessel has ammunition. Yefremenko, in the torpedo compartment, defused the warhead with depth charges going off outside the hull. When he finished, he reported to the control room. Marinesco acknowledged the report without looking up from the chart table. He was already planning the escape route. 40 minutes later, S-13 had opened enough distance from the Lowe to consider itself clear. Marinesco ordered the crew to stand down from battle stations. Inside the submarine, the crew celebrated. They had hit a large ship. They could hear it on the hydrophones. Something enormous was dying on the surface above them. They did not know what ship it was. They did not know how many people were on it. They knew they had hit something significant, something large enough to produce the secondary explosions they were hearing through the hull. And that was enough. Marinesco sat at the chart table and wrote his initial contact report. Ship type, large passenger liner or transport. Tonnage, estimated at 25,000 tons. Attack result, 3 hits. Target appears to be sinking. He expected, when S-13 returned to port, to be received as a hero. He had just sunk the largest tonnage of any submarine commander of any nation in a single attack in the entire Second World War. He had also killed more civilians in a single night than any submarine in history. He did not know the second part yet. 9,000 Heinz Schön was sitting on the floor of the ballroom, writing in his diary when the first torpedo hit. He described it later as the sensation of being inside a bell when someone strikes it. Not an explosion exactly, more like the entire ship becoming a single vibrating object. People around him fell. The lights flickered and held. A sound came from somewhere below that he said was unlike anything he had heard before. A tearing sound, low and sustained, like the ship itself was in healing. He had enough time to think. That was a torpedo. Then the second torpedo hit. Then the third. The lights went out. In the 4 seconds between the first and third impact, 3 things happened to the Wilhelm Gustloff that turned a disaster into a catastrophe. The first torpedo hit the bow, flooding the forward crew compartments. Those compartments were where 918 naval cadets, submarine officer trainees aged 17 to 22, had been assigned to sleep. Most of them were in their bunks. The bow section flooded so fast that the majority of them did not have time to reach the hatch. The second torpedo hit the forward section of the hull, directly below the swimming pool. The pool was dry, but the corridor system around it was packed with civilian refugees who had taken floor space wherever they could find it. The structural damage from the second torpedo collapsed sections of the corridor walls and jammed several of the watertight doors that were supposed to slow the flooding below decks. The third torpedo hit the engine room. The ship lost power. Darkness. 10,000 people, 30 meters above the waterline in the upper decks, falling to 0 meters at the waterline in the lower decks. No lights, no internal communications, no way for anyone in one part of the ship to know what had happened in any other part. The ship began to list to port. Here is what a list means and why it matters. A ship lists when one side takes on more water than the other. The Gustloff, hit on the port side, began tilting in that direction almost immediately. By the time the ship's surviving officers reached their stations, the list was already past 15 degrees. Within 10 minutes, it was past 30. At 30 degrees of list, the lifeboats on the starboard side, the high side, were angled far enough away from the hull that lowering them meant dropping them into free air rather than against the ship's side. The release mechanisms were not designed for that angle. The boats swung outward and hung uselessly. The lifeboats on the port side, the low side, were already at or below the waterline. The Gustloff had carried enough lifeboats to hold approximately 5,000 people. In the chaos and the dark and the list, the vast majority of those lifeboats were either unreachable or unusable within the first 15 minutes of the sinking. The ship had been designed for 1,900 people. Even if every lifeboat had deployed perfectly, it held enough for half the people it was carrying that night. With the list, the effectively usable lifeboat capacity in the water in the first 20 minutes was a fraction of that. People understood this. Not all of them, not immediately, but enough. The upper decks filled with people who had no lifeboat to board, standing in minus 18-degree air, looking at the water. Below decks, in the dark, it was different. Schoen had made it to a corridor on the promenade level. He was pushing toward a staircase, away from the lower sections. Around him, in the dark, he could hear the sound of the crowd, moving in the same direction and pressing from both sides and not always making forward progress. He later wrote that the specific sound he remembered was not screaming. It was the sound of people breathing, hundreds of people breathing together in a closed space in the dark, and the sound of the ship working against itself as the structure took on water. In the section of the ship below the swimming pool, water had entered through the damaged corridor walls and was rising in the spaces where people had been sleeping. The pool itself, the drained swimming pool, where families had staked out floor space, had flooded from below. The pool's edge was high enough that when the water came in fast, in the dark, in a tilting ship. People inside it could not get out. The same pool that had been used for vacationing workers in 1938, that had sat empty for 6 years, had collected hundreds of civilians who now had nowhere to go. The wounded soldiers in the medical areas on the lower decks could not move on their own. The medical staff who had been caring for them tried to find ways to move them. Some succeeded. The records of who succeeded and who did not are incomplete, because most of the people who would have kept those records did not survive. At the waterline, people were going into the water. The Baltic Sea on January 30th, 1945, was approximately 4 degrees Celsius. That is not frozen, but it is close. A person in water at that temperature, without a survival suit, will begin losing the ability to control their muscles within 10 minutes. Within 30 minutes, they will lose consciousness. Within an hour, they will die. The people who jumped from the Gustloff, or were pushed or fell in the chaos, were not going to drown first. They were going to lose control of their bodies before they drowned. Their arms would stop responding. They would stop being able to keep their heads above water. And then they would inhale. And then they would go under. This is what the Baltic means in January. Not a dramatic drowning, a slow shutdown. The body closing down system by system, like a machine running out of power. The torpedo boat Lowe, which had been the Gustloff's only escort, had turned toward S-13's last position when the attack began. When it became clear the submarine was not going to surface and the Gustloff was going down, the Lowe turned back. It began pulling people from the water. The Lowe was a small vessel, not designed for rescue operations, built for speed and firepower. Its crew threw ropes and netting over the side. They pulled people aboard by hand. Some of the people they reached were already unconscious. In the hours after the torpedoing, other German vessels picked up the radio calls and moved toward the site. Another torpedo boat, 2 minesweepers, a passenger ferry. They arrived in stages, the nearest first, and they pulled people from the water in the dark for hours. Some of the people in the water were already dead when the ropes reached them. On the Lowe, sailors pulled a woman aboard who was holding a baby inside her coat. The baby was alive. The woman died within minutes of reaching the deck. Her body temperature had fallen too far in the time she had been in the water. There is a documented account from a rescue vessel of sailors on deck, catching children who were thrown up from the water by people in the sea who could not climb aboard themselves. The sailors stood at the rail and caught what was thrown to them. Not everything was caught. Sean made it to the open deck. He found a section of railing on the starboard side, the high side, where the ship's list had created a pocket of space away from the main crowd. He assessed the water below him. He could see the Lowe moving through the dark, its searchlights sweeping. He waited as long as he thought he could. Then he went into the water. The cold hit him in a way he later said no description of cold had ever prepared him for. Not a sensation of cold, but a sensation of being grabbed from every direction simultaneously. He got his head above water. He kept it there. He swam toward the Lowe's lights. He was in the water for 11 minutes before a rope reached him. He was one of the ones who made it. The Wilhelm Gustloff went under at approximately 1 in the morning on January 31st, 1945. Less than 2 hours after the first torpedo hit. When it was gone, the rescue vessels moved through what was left on the surface. The water was covered with objects. clothing, wooden furniture that had floated out of the open decks, life preservers, some with people still in them, some without. The cold had done its work quickly. The crews of the rescue vessels described working in silence because there was nothing to say. By morning, the count of survivors recorded across all rescue vessels was 1,239. 10,582 people had boarded the Gustloff. 1,239 were alive. 9,343 people had died in a single night. In the cold, in the dark, in the Baltic Sea, 50 kilometers from the coast of a country that no longer existed in the form it had when the ship was built. The largest single loss of life in maritime history. By morning, Soviet radio reported the sinking as a military victory. A German troop transport and submarine training vessel had been destroyed. The announcement mentioned no civilian passengers. It mentioned no specific number of dead. No announcement mentioned 9,343. The Conspiracy of Silence, S-13, returned to the Soviet naval base at Turku on February 15, 1945. Marinescu had been at sea for 35 days. He had sunk 2 ships. The first was the Gustloff. The second was the Steuben, a smaller German vessel he attacked 12 days later, on February 10th in the same Baltic waters. Another 2,800 people went down with the Steuben. Another night of depth charges. Another crew celebrating through a hydrophone. By the time Marinescu returned to port, he was carrying a question he could not yet fully ask himself. On the Gustloff, he had not known what he was shooting at. On the Steuben, he had been in the same waters. 11 days after the Gustloff sinking had been reported in Soviet military dispatches. He had known by then that the Baltic was full of evacuation ships, full of civilians trying to move west. He had known, and he had attacked anyway, because that was what the orders said, and because a submarine commander in January 1945 could not afford to ask too many questions about who was on a ship before he fired. What Marinescu thought about that in the years that followed is not recorded either. He left no memoir. He gave few interviews. What he said, when he said anything, was that it was war, and he did what war required. The base commander came to the dock to meet him. Marinescu expected the tribunal to be dropped. He expected orders for a medal ceremony. He expected something commensurate with what he had done. What he received was a handshake, a brief acknowledgement, and the information that the fleet commander would review his record. His recommendation for Hero of the Soviet Union, submitted by his direct superior within days of the Gustloff sinking, sat in the Baltic Fleet's administrative system for months without a decision. In September 1945, 4 months after Germany surrendered, Marinescu was demoted from captain 3rd rank to lieutenant. The official reason given was his history of disciplinary violations. The tribunal from Turku, rather than being dropped, had been quietly folded into his permanent record. He was removed from submarine command in October 1945. He never commanded another vessel. What happened to Alexander Marinescu in the years after the war tells you something precise about how the Soviet Union understood what he had done. He worked in a series of civilian jobs. He managed a supply depot. He worked in a factory. He was convicted in 1949 of misappropriating government property from a warehouse where he worked, a charge that people who knew him disputed vigorously and that some historians believe was fabricated by authorities who wanted him quietly out of the way. He was sentenced to 3 years in a Soviet labor camp. The man who had achieved the single greatest submarine attack of the entire Second World War, who had sunk more enemy tonnage in one patrol than any other submarine commander in history, served time in a labor camp a few years after the war ended. He was released in 1951. He worked more civilian jobs. He developed cancer. He died in Leningrad on January 15th, 1963. He was 49 years old. His naval file showed his demotion and his conviction. It showed the disciplinary violations going back years. It did not show how many people he had killed in the Baltic. That number was classified. 27 years after his death, on May 5th, 1990, the Soviet government awarded Alexander Marinescu the title Hero of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. He received the award he deserved with 1 year to spare, before the country that gave it to him ceased to exist. Nobody wanted to tell the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff. Not in 1945, not in 1955, not in 1975. The silence was not accidental. It was produced by 3 separate governments, each looking at the same disaster and calculating independently that keeping quiet was better than speaking. Germany could not tell the story. In the country that had built the Gustloff and named it after a Nazi martyr, grieving 9,343 German dead required answering a question that had no acceptable answer. How do you mourn the victims of a country that was simultaneously operating extermination camps? German suffering existed. It was real. The refugees on the Gustloff were real people who died real deaths. But the political space for German victimhood in 1945 and for decades afterward was essentially zero. Anyone who raised the subject was immediately suspected of trying to diminish the Holocaust, of using German dead as a counterweight against German crimes. So the dead stayed where they were, on the bottom of the Baltic Sea, uncounted in public. The Soviet Union could not tell the story. The official announcement of the sinking described it as a military victory against a troop transport. That was partly true. There were soldiers on the Gustloff. There were also 6,000 civilians. Publishing the real casualty figures would have required admitting that the greatest naval victory in Soviet submarine history had mostly killed women and children. It would have raised questions about whether the attack was a war crime. It was easier to keep the numbers classified and let Marinescu quietly disappear. The West did not tell the story because the West was not interested. In 1945, after 5 years of war and millions of Allied dead, there was no appetite for narratives about German suffering. The story of the Gustloff, if it had been told in 1945, would have been Germans died. And in 1945, that was not news in any sense that a Western audience was prepared to receive. The 3 silences held for nearly 60 years. In 2002, a German writer named Günter Grass published a novel called Crab Walk. Grass was already famous, already considered one of the major figures of post-war German literature. The novel told the story of the Gustloff through the perspective of a survivor's son, a man trying to come to terms with a disaster that his country had never officially processed. The book asked, directly, the question that had gone unasked for decades: is there space in the historical record for German suffering? Can a country that committed the Holocaust also have victims? The novel was read by hundreds of thousands of people. It produced more public discussion about the Gustloff than anything that had come before it. It was reviewed in every major newspaper in Germany and across Europe. For the first time, the number 9343 began appearing in mainstream historical conversation. 4 years later, in 2006, Gunter Grass disclosed something he had not mentioned in any previous interview, any previous memoir, any previous piece of writing in 60 years of public life. He had been a member of the Waffen-SS during the war. He had served in a combat division of the SS from 1944 until Germany surrendered. He had never told anyone. The man who had written the book demanding that Germany find space to acknowledge its own victims had spent 60 years hiding his own membership in the organization most directly associated with German crimes. This is not a coincidence you can ignore. It does not cancel what the book said. The 9,343 people on the Gustloff were still dead. But it tells you something about the density of the silence around this story, about how deeply the layers ran, about how many people touched this history, and then put it back down and walked away. In 2003, Polish divers located the wreck of the Wilhelm Gustloff in the southern Baltic Sea. It lies at a depth of 44 meters, roughly the height of a 12-story building below the surface. The ship is largely intact. The hull is recognizable. Some of the internal structures have collapsed under the pressure of 6 decades underwater, but the general form of the vessel is still there on the seafloor. It is classified as a war grave under international maritime law. Diving to it is legal. Disturbing the wreck is not. There are people inside it. Some of the 9,343 are still in the rooms they were in when the torpedoes hit. They have been there for 80 years. The ship was not memorialized when the war ended. There was no official ceremony marking what happened in that water on the night of January 30th, 1945. There were no proceedings in any court assessing legal responsibility for the 6,050 civilians who died in a military attack. There was no government inquiry into why 10,582 people were loaded onto a ship designed for 1,900. There was no accountability for the officer who turned on the navigation lights. There was no accountability for the decision to take the deep water route. There was accountability for none of it, in any country, at any time. 3 people define the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff. None of them ever met each other. None of them ever spoke about the others publicly. But their lives were connected by a chain of decisions that stretched across a decade. And the ship was the point where all 3 chains converged. Alexander Marinescu died in Leningrad in 1963, sick and poor, his greatest achievement classified, and his name absent from any official history. He never knew the exact number of people who died when his torpedoes hit. The Soviet government that held that number never told him. Heinz Schoen spent 40 years trying to make the story real. He interviewed survivors. He wrote books. He built the most complete record that exists of those 50 minutes. He died in 2013, 90 years old, still largely unknown outside of a narrow circle of maritime historians and German war researchers. He was in the water for 11 minutes on the night of January 30th, 1945. He spent the rest of his life in that water. David Frankfurter walked out of prison in October 1945. He read about the sinking in a newspaper. He had been inside when it happened. the ship named after the man he killed, had gone down 9 months before he was free to read about it. He emigrated. He lived a quiet life. He died in 1982, 46 years after he had stood in a hallway with a gun intending to die, having outlived the man he killed, the ship that bore that man's name, and the war that the ship was part of. What he thought when he read that newspaper is not recorded. He left no account of it. The ship is still on the bottom of the Baltic Sea, 44 meters down. The hull is intact. Some of the 9,343 are still in the rooms they were in when the first torpedo hit. They have been there for 80 years. No country has held a formal ceremony at the site. No court has assigned responsibility. No government has said, directly and completely, what happened and who made it happen. 9,343 people, 6 times the Titanic, 44 meters down, in water too cold and too dark to see anything from the surface.